What happens when the toughest cowboy in Red Hollow chooses the one woman the whole town decided didn't deserve to be chosen, and then bets everything on her? They laughed at him. They pitied her. And when the drought came and the cattle disappeared and the wolves, both animal and human, circled closer, everyone in Red Hollow was absolutely certain that Cole Mercer had made the worst mistake of his life. But here's what nobody understood yet. The quiet girl they'd spent years looking past had been quietly watching, quietly learning, quietly waiting. And she was the only one in that entire broken town who actually knew how to save it. Hit like drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Red Hollow, Texas. Spring, 1883. The trouble with Red Hollow was that everybody knew everybody else's business, and half of what they knew wasn't true. It was a settlement that had earned its name honestly, a raw wound carved into the Texas flatlands by wind and stubbornness, maybe 200 souls pressed together between the canyon rim to the west and the cattle road running south. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon with a crooked sign that someone had nailed up drunk and never bothered to fix, and 3 churches for a population that needed their sins divided into manageable portions. The land was hard clay and scrub grass, the kind of ground that broke plows and broke men with equal indifference. Summer turned it the color of old rust. Winter turned it gray. Spring gave it 2 good weeks before the heat came back to ruin everything. But people stayed. People always stayed in places like Red Hollow, because leaving took a kind of courage that was harder to come by than it looked. Cole Mercer had come to the settlement 6 years ago with $60, a horse named August, and a reputation from 3 counties over that had arrived before him. He wasn't the fastest gun in the territory. He'd have told you that himself, and then told you the names of 4 men who were faster and one who was dead for thinking otherwise. What Cole was capable. He could read weather by the way crows sat on a fence post. He could fix a wagon axle with equipment that wasn't meant for it. He understood cattle in the way some men understood cards, instinctively, without being able to fully explain the process. And he worked his land with a kind of grim, bone-deep commitment that the older ranchers around Red Hollow recognized and respected even when they didn't particularly like him. He'd bought 40 acres on the east side of the canyon lip, built his house with his own hands over 2 winters, and slowly, painfully slowly, turned a failing herd into something that almost qualified as profitable. He had 23 cattle. He had a good well. He had a neighbor 3 miles south named Huck Pedersen, who he trusted about 60% of the time, which was better than most. What Cole Mercer did not have, and what the women of Red Hollow had decided was a problem requiring immediate correction, was a wife. Sut. The widow Darlene Fitch was the first to make her interest known. This was not a surprise to anyone. Darlene was 32, still striking in the way that a well-maintained house is striking. Everything in its right place, nothing left to chance. Her late husband, Gerald Fitch, had owned the better part of the general store before a horse put him in the ground, and what Darlene had inherited was modest but real. She wore her dark hair swept up in a style that said, "I am serious, and I am still worth looking at in the same breath," and she had a laugh that she deployed like a tool. She found Cole at the livery on a Thursday morning in late April, while he was paying for a load of feed he couldn't quite afford. "Mr. Mercer," she said, stepping carefully around a puddle that hadn't been there before the rain, "I don't believe we've spoken properly." Cole looked up. He was a broad man, not tall exactly, but built in a way that made him seem to occupy more space than his actual dimensions. He had a face that had been weathered by enough seasons to look carved rather than grown, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 5 days, and dark eyes that had the unsettling habit of going very still when he was thinking hard about something. "We haven't," he agreed. Darlene smiled. It was a good smile. She'd practiced it. "I host supper on the first Friday of each month, a small gathering, some of the better families in town." She let a pause sit there, doing its work. "I'd be honored if you'd join us." Cole looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "That's kind of you," he said. "I'll think on it." He didn't go. 2 weeks later, Clara Voss tried. Clara was the younger daughter of the Voss family, who had land further north and money further back. Old money. The territorial kind that came from being in the right place before anyone else realized the place was worth being in. She was pretty in a conventional, uncomplicated way. with blonde hair and a manner that had been trained since childhood to project warmth without inviting too much proximity. She intercepted Cole outside the post office. "Everyone says you're a hard man to find," she said, trying to be charming. "I'm not hiding," Cole said. "I just thought, Miss Voss." He said it the way you'd say stop, gently, but without room for misunderstanding. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not looking for what you're offering, whatever that is." She stared at him. He touched the brim of his hat, collected his mail, and walked back to his horse. Clara went home and told her mother, and her mother told Darlene Fitch. And from there, the story spread through Red Hollow the way small-town stories always spread. By the time it was through traveling, Cole Mercer had apparently insulted half the eligible women in the territory and declared himself content to die alone with his cattle. None of that was true. But in Red Hollow, truth was less important than narrative. Mabel Rowan lived in a small house on the north edge of town with her father, who drank too much and worked too little, and her arrangement with the world was the following. She existed at its margins, and it largely pretended she wasn't there. And that was fine. That was the deal. She was 24 years old and she was heavy, not unhealthy, but solidly, obviously, unmistakably large in a town and era that treated a woman's body as a public matter subject to public commentary. She had her mother's face, which would have been considered pretty in a previous century, with wide-set brown eyes and a mouth that turned up slightly at the corners, even in repose. Her hair was dark and thick, and she kept it braided simply because she had no patience for the elaborate constructions that other women spent their mornings on. She wore practical clothing, she took up space, and she knew it, and she had decided some years ago to stop apologizing for it. This decision had not made her popular. What Mabel had, in place of popularity, was something harder to categorize. She read. She read everything. The newspapers that came in on the mail coach, the agricultural almanacs that accumulated in the post office when no one claimed them, the surveying documents and water rights filings and geological reports that the county sent out once a year and that everyone else used to start fires. She had a quality of attention that was almost unnerving. When Mabel looked at something, she actually looked the way most people never bothered to. She did laundry for 4 families in town, including the Voss family, which was exactly as humbling as it sounds, and she helped her father with the small vegetable plot behind their house, which produced enough to eat and sometimes enough to sell. She had a talent for silence that most people confused with stupidity, and she had learned not to correct the misimpression because correcting it never helped. She had noticed Cole Mercer the way she noticed most things in Red Hollow, quietly, from a distance, without expectation. She'd seen him in the Mercantile on a Wednesday afternoon about 2 months before the story really began, standing in front of the seed display with a look on his face like a man doing difficult arithmetic in his head. He'd picked up a packet, put it down, picked up another one. The girl behind the counter was watching him with the barely concealed impatience of someone who had better things to do. "The ryegrass," Mabel said, from where she was standing 3 feet to his left. Cole looked at her. "If you're deciding between the ryegrass and the buffalo grass," she continued, not meeting his eyes, focusing on the shelf. "For early season grazing, the ryegrass establishes faster, but the buffalo grass holds up better once the heat hits and it comes back stronger each year without replanting. Depends what you're trying to solve for." A beat of silence. "Clay soil?" she added. "East side of the canyon?" "How'd you know that?" "I've seen your parcel on the survey maps." She shrugged, a small, contained movement. "The ryegrass won't take as well as you want it to in that soil. You'd be doing it again in 2 seasons. Cole looked at her for a long moment. "You do surveying?" "No, I just read the surveys." She picked up the buffalo grass seed. "This one." And she moved off toward the back of the store without looking back. Cole stood there for a moment. Then he picked up the buffalo grass seed. He paid for it and left without speaking to her again. And Mabel thought that was probably the end of it. It wasn't. He came into the laundry on a Tuesday. Mabel was elbow-deep in a vat of soapy water, working through a pile of shirts that belonged to Judge Hardcastle, who had more shirts than any single man needed, and who apparently had no concept of what constituted a reasonable stain. She heard the door open and didn't look up, because looking up every time a door opened was a habit she'd trained herself out of years ago. "Mrs. Rowan?" "Miss," she said, "and whatever you need for wash, you leave it on the bench by the door. 2 days for regular, 3 for heavy wool." "I don't have washing." She looked up. Cole Mercer was standing just inside the doorway, hat in hand, looking about as comfortable as a man standing in a room full of feminine industry generally looks, which was not very. He had mud on his boots and a cut across the back of his left hand that was fresh enough to still be angry looking. "What happened to your hand?" she asked. He looked down at it like he'd forgotten it was there. "Wire fence." "Did you clean it?" "Some." "Some is how people lose hands to infection," she said, matter-of-factly. She dried her own hands on her apron. "Come here." He came, with the cautious expression of a man not sure how he'd ended up following instructions but finding himself unable to stop. Mabel produced a small tin of antiseptic from under the counter and a clean cloth, and she cleaned his hand with brisk efficiency and absolutely no gentleness, because gentleness with a wire cut was a kindness that became a cruelty later when infection set in anyway. "That's good," he said, not about the cleaning, which was clearly uncomfortable. He meant something else. "The buffalo grass?" she guessed. "Came in better than I expected." He watched her wrap a strip of clean linen around the cut. "Where'd you learn about grass varieties?" "Almanac, and a soil composition report that came through the county office 2 years ago." She tied off the bandage. "Nobody picked it up." "So you just read it?" "I read most things nobody else wants." She stepped back. "You should keep that clean. Change the wrap tomorrow." Cole stood there with his bandaged hand, looking at her with that quality of attention she'd noticed he had. The same stillness, the same sense that whatever he was looking at, he was actually seeing. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why do you know things about canyon water tables?" Mabel blinked. "What?" "The survey maps, the soil reports, the almanacs." He tilted his head slightly. "The canyon runs east of your property. The water tables in that region are ranching knowledge. You don't ranch." It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said to her in years, possibly ever. She didn't answer immediately, which was unusual for her. She was normally quick with deflection. But something about the directness of the question caught her off guard, and her default responses didn't come fast enough. "The springs," she said finally, "at the base of the canyon, the ones everyone says are dried up." "They've been dry for 8 years. "Dry at the surface," she said. "The underground channels are still there. I've been—" She stopped herself. He waited. "I've been mapping them," she said, with the wariness of someone expecting to be laughed at. "In my head, mostly. And on paper. The old wagon routes used to follow the water table north through the canyon before the main road was built. If the springs were accessible again—" "The old springs have been inaccessible since before the settlement was established," Cole said. "They're inaccessible because nobody's tried to dig past the shale layer," Mabel said, with a firmness that was different from her usual careful neutrality. "There's a report from a geological survey in '71 that described an underground channel system running under the North Canyon wall, 20 feet down, maybe 25. The shale is only about 4 feet thick at the widest point." Silence. "You've read a geological survey from 1871, Cole said. "I told you I read things nobody else wants." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she looked away first, which she hated doing. "I have to go," she said, turning back to the vat of shirts. "Thank you," Cole said, "for the hand." He meant both the bandage and the information, and they both knew it. He left, and the laundry felt too quiet in the way that a room does when the conversation you just had was more significant than you'd allowed yourself to expect. The social architecture of Red Hollow was not complicated, but it was rigid, and the architecture worked like this. There were people who were considered worthy of consideration, and there were people who were not, and the line between those two groups was drawn by money and appearance and lineage and almost nothing else. Cole Mercer, despite arriving with $60 and no visible family connections, had climbed into the worthy category through a combination of his land, his competence, and the fact that he was, by any honest accounting, an attractive man. Red Hollow respected competence when it had no better option, and it liked the idea of a rugged, self-made rancher in the frontier tradition. Cole was a narrative the town could get behind. Mabel Rowan was a different kind of narrative entirely, and it was not one the town had much use for. She was poor, which the town considered almost forgivable in the abstract but deeply unpleasant in the specific. She was her father's daughter, which meant she was attached by blood to a man who owed money to several establishments, and who appeared at the saloon with a regularity that had become its own kind of joke. And she was large, which Red Hollow treated as a moral failing rather than a physical fact, because small towns have always needed their cruelties to feel justified. Nobody had been deliberately cruel to Mabel in the direct, obvious way. There had been no single incident, no villain speech, no dramatic confrontation. What there had been for most of her life was something harder to fight, the casual, ongoing fact of being overlooked, being passed over, being the name that came up last in conversations, if it came up at all, being the person in the room that people's eyes slid past without registering. She had built a life inside that invisibility. She had made it almost comfortable. Cole Mercer kept disrupting the comfort. He came back to the laundry 3 weeks later, not with washing and not with an injured hand. He came with a question about the canyon survey and a crumpled piece of paper on which he had, with more diligence than skill, attempted to reproduce the sections she had apparently described to him. "You drew this?" she asked, looking at the paper. "Tried to, from what you said." He looked slightly embarrassed, which was not an expression she associated with him. "I got the north section wrong." Mabel looked at the drawing for a long moment, then turned it 90 degrees. "You've got the orientation off. The channel doesn't run south to north. It angles northeast, then hooks back. Here." She flattened the paper on the counter. "Do you have a pencil?" They spent 40 minutes at the laundry counter with a pencil stub, Mabel drawing and explaining, and Cole asking questions that were more specific than she expected. He'd done his own work since their last conversation. She could tell from the questions, which referenced actual geological concepts rather than the vague cowboy intuition she'd anticipated. He'd found, or borrowed, or bought something to read. The fact that he'd done that he'd taken what she said seriously enough to go away and learn more, did something peculiar to Mabel's chest that she wasn't prepared to examine closely. "If the shale breaks clean at 20 feet, he said, tracing the line she'd drawn with one finger, "the water would travel east along this channel and surface, past the big boulders north of the dead cottonwood stand," she said. "I've walked it. You can hear the water in the dry season if you put your ear to the ground in that section." He looked at her. "I know how that sounds," she said. "It sounds like something worth knowing," he said. The town noticed them before they had anything to notice. This was the nature of Red Hollow. The first time Cole tied his horse outside the laundry and went in for longer than would reasonably be required to drop off washing, someone saw. The second time, someone talked. By the third time, it was established fact that Cole Mercer was pursuing Mabel Rowan, a development that produced a quality of civic confusion that would have been funny in a different context. Why, the town kept asking each other. The question was posed in 100 different ways. It was asked over fences and across counters and in the pews of all 3 churches. It was asked with genuine puzzlement, with poorly concealed disgust, with the particular brand of friendly concern that is actually neither friendly nor concerned. Has he lost his mind? Has he not seen the widows that want him? Does he not understand what he's doing to his prospects? The widow Darlene Fitch took it personally, which was understandable if uncharitable. She had put genuine effort into being visible to Cole Mercer, and the idea that she had been passed over for a penniless, heavy girl who did other people's washing was not a reality she processed gracefully. "There must be something wrong with him," she said to Clara Voss on the steps of the general store, on a Tuesday morning that Mabel happened to be crossing the street during. A man in his position, with his opportunities. To look twice at that? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Mabel heard it. She heard it the way you always hear the things that are meant for you and not meant for you at the same time. The words traveling through the air and landing accurately on the exact piece of you that is least defended. She kept walking. She didn't slow down, didn't look over. Her face didn't change. She was very good at that. She'd had a lot of practice. 1. Cole came to her father's house on a Thursday evening in late May. This was the moment that made it real for Red Hollow, because you could explain away laundry conversations and chance meetings at the Mercantile, but a man at the door on a Thursday evening was a different declaration entirely. Elias Rowan answered the door with the glassy-eyed caution of a man who'd been at the bottle since mid-afternoon, and Cole stood on the porch with his hat in both hands, looking like he'd rather be somewhere considerably more difficult. "Mr. Rowan," he said, "my name is Cole Mercer. I have the ranch east of the canyon. I know who you are, Elias said, with the dignity of the thoroughly pickled. I'd like to speak with Mabel, if she's willing. A pause. Elias looked at him with the unfocused skepticism of a man who couldn't quite identify the trick. Mabel! He called over his shoulder without moving from the doorway. Mabel appeared from the back of the house with flour on her hands and a look of complete blankness that was itself a kind of expression. She took in Cole on the porch, her father in the doorway, and the situation as a whole, and her face did approximately nothing visible. Mr. Mercer. Miss Rowan, I was hoping... He stopped, started again. I was hoping you'd take a walk with me. Elias Rowan squinted at the horizon with the air of a man performing fatherly consideration. Where to? Just the North Road, Cole said. 30 minutes. Back by dark? Yes, sir. Elias stepped aside with the satisfied nod of someone who had acquitted himself adequately in a social situation, which he had not, and Mabel untied her apron and got her coat without looking at Cole directly, and stepped off the porch into the early evening air. They walked a full 2 minutes before either of them spoke. You didn't have to do that, Mabel said finally. Come to the house. I know I didn't have to. My father's not... She stopped. He's not always that way. He seems all right, Cole said, which was generous to the point of being a kindness. He's not, Mabel said, because she had no patience for the other kind of kindness, the kind that required her to pretend. Cole didn't press it. They walked a bit further. I want to ask you something, he said. You seem to have a lot of questions. About the springs, about the canyon route, about... He seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. Would you be willing to show me? In person. The section where you can hear the water. Mabel stopped walking. Cole stopped too, 2 steps ahead, and turned. Why? She asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously. Because I think you're right about where it is, and I think... He paused again. I think if you're right, it changes the calculus for the whole East Range. Not just for me, for the other ranchers in the canyon area. He met her eyes. And I think you've been sitting on information that nobody's ever bothered to ask you for. Something happened in the air between them. Mabel had a quality of stillness that matched his. 2 people who had both learned, for different reasons, not to show their hands. Everyone thinks you've lost your mind, she said. Spending time with me? I know what everyone thinks. Do you care? A pause. I care about what's true, Cole said. The rest of it works itself out, or it doesn't. She looked at him for a long time with those wide, direct brown eyes. Saturday morning, she said. I'll meet you at the cottonwood stand, early. Early, he agreed. They walked back in the cooling dusk, not quite side by side, not quite not, and the town that had been watching from various windows had a great deal to say about it before the night was out. Saturday was clear and cool with the wind coming off the canyon that carried the smell of red clay and dry grass. Mabel was at the cottonwood stand 20 minutes before she'd said she'd be, because she was always early to things when she was nervous, and she refused to acknowledge to herself that she was nervous. Cole arrived exactly on time, which told her something about him. August, the horse, was tied back from the canyon edge, and Cole came on foot, which told her something else. Here, she said, and she led him along the base of the canyon wall, picking her way between the rocks with the ease of someone who'd made this walk many times. Her boots were practical, heavy, worn at the heel, resolute. She moved well in rough terrain, with a sureness of foot that belied the assumption that size was a limitation. At a point about 100 yards north of the cottonwoods, she stopped. Put your hand here, she said, pressing her own palm flat against the canyon wall. The rock was cold, which was normal, but there was something else, a faint vibration, barely there, like a voice in the next room heard through 2 walls. Cole crouched and pressed his hand to the stone. A beat. That's water, he said quietly. Moving water. She straightened. There's a pool below the shale layer. The survey called it a subsurface reservoir, fed by runoff from further up the canyon, filtering through limestone. It hasn't dried up. It just went underground when the shale shifted around 75. Cole stood slowly, looking at the canyon wall with an expression that was calculating but also something adjacent to wonder. If we can get to it, he said. The shale layer is here. She walked 6 feet north, put her hand on the wall at a lower point. And here it's thinner on the north face. Drill equipment, or even a sustained pick effort with the right crew, could break through. How long have you been sitting on this? A couple of years, she said honestly, and you never told anyone. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. Who would I have told? The question sat there in the morning air, unanswered, because it answered itself. Cole looked away, out across the canyon. His jaw was tight with something. Not anger, something else. Something that might have been, if you were watching carefully, a kind of anger on her behalf. I'm telling you, she said, more quietly than she'd intended. That counts for something. He looked back at her. It counts for a lot, he said. And that was the beginning of the thing that Red Hollow would spend the next year trying to understand. They walked back in near silence, which was comfortable in the way silences are when neither person needs to fill them. Mabel's thoughts were running ahead of her. Water access, route mapping, equipment, the conversations with ranchers she didn't know how to have. And Cole was quiet with the focused quality of a man building something in his head. At the edge of town, he stopped. I have to ask you something else, he said. She braced herself because, in her experience, something else tended to be the part where reality arrived. People are going to talk, he said. People are already talking. More, he said. They're going to say things about you, about me, about... He stopped. I want to be honest with you about that, because it seems like the only fair thing. Mabel studied his face. He was not apologizing. He was not preparing to walk it back. He was just telling her the truth about what was coming in the way you tell someone about weather before they step outside. I've heard everything they're likely to say, she told him. I've been hearing variations of it for most of my adult life. That's not, he said it with the edge. That's not how it should be. No, she agreed, but here we are. A pause. The wind moved between them with that canyon smell. Are you willing? He asked. Just that. Mabel looked at him. She thought about the geological survey she'd read 4 times. She thought about the springs she'd pressed her ear to the ground to hear. She thought about all the knowledge she'd accumulated that had nowhere to go, no audience, no application. All that careful attention poured into the void of a town that had decided she wasn't worth asking. I'm willing, she said. Cole nodded once. He touched the brim of his hat, that same small gesture, and walked back toward the livery. And Mabel walked north toward home with the strangest feeling sitting in her chest, heavy and weightless at once, like something that had been compressed for a very long time was slowly beginning to take up its proper space. Her father was asleep in the chair when she came home. The bottle was 2/3 empty on the table beside him. She put her coat on its hook, washed her hands, and stood at the window looking out at the north road for a moment before she went back to work. The town would talk. It always did. But for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, Mabel Rowan found that she couldn't make herself care as much as she'd learned to pretend to. The summer came in hard that year, the way summer always came to Red Hollow, without apology and without transition. One week the mornings were still cool enough to need a coat. The next, the heat was there at 5 in the morning like a visitor who'd moved in uninvited and showed no signs of leaving. Cole and Mabel met twice more at the canyon, and once at the laundry when there was actually washing, and once, briefly, accidentally, in the way that accidents tend to happen in small towns, at the post office, where they happened to arrive at the same moment from opposite directions and had a conversation about the canyon survey that lasted 20 minutes on the steps while 3 separate people found reasons to walk past. The town watched. The town talked. And Cole Mercer went about his work with the steady, deliberate calm of a man who had decided something and was not in the business of undeciding. He did not court Mabel in the conventional sense. There were no formal suppers, no official declarations made to her father, no flowers, which was not a Red Hollow custom anyway, but which would have registered as a meaningful gesture. What there was instead was attention. Real attention. The kind that showed up in what he remembered and what he asked and how carefully he listened when she spoke. He remembered that she'd mentioned the geological survey from 71. He found a copy. He read it. He came back with questions that showed he'd read it carefully, not performatively. He noticed that she never ate when he was present, even when a meal was clearly available, and she would reasonably be hungry. And he understood without being told that this was the particular armor she'd developed against a world that watched her eat and felt entitled to comment on it. He made no reference to this. He simply, gradually, made food available in ways that didn't require her to eat in front of him, leaving a packet of dried fruit on the canyon wall once, saying he'd brought too much, which was transparently false, but served its purpose. She noticed all of this. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, precisely, without drawing attention to the noticing, filing it away in the part of her mind where she stored information that mattered. He was not perfect. He was impatient in ways he sometimes controlled and sometimes didn't. He was bad at receiving help from others. The particular stubbornness of a man who had been self-sufficient for long enough that accepting assistance felt like an admission of something. He had silences that went darker than the regular kind sometimes, usually in the late evening, usually when he'd been looking toward the canyon with the expression of a man adding up numbers he didn't like. Mabel respected the imperfections. Perfection would have made him too easy to dismiss. By July, the situation had defined itself enough that Elias Rowan sobered up on a Sunday afternoon for long enough to ask his daughter what exactly was happening. They were on the back porch. Mabel was mending a shirt. Her father was drinking coffee and having the specific expression of a man bracing himself. "That rancher," Elias said. "Mercer. He comes around a lot." "Yes," Mabel said. "People are saying things." "I know." "He's serious about you?" Mabel set down the shirt. She looked at her father. This man she loved with the exhausted, clear-eyed love that people develop for family members they have been caring for since childhood, who require more than they contribute, and who mean well most of the time and who are not ever going to be different. "I think so," she said. "Yes." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He knows—" He stopped, started again. "He knows what people say." "He knows." Another pause. Her father turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He seems solid enough," Elias said finally, with the halting effort of a man trying to say something he hadn't practiced. "For a man who doesn't talk much." "He's solid," Mabel agreed. Elias nodded. He looked out at the vegetable plot, at the scraggly bean plants and the okay-looking squash, and the thing that was supposed to be cucumber but had developed its own ambitions. "You deserve solid," he said. Very quietly, with the particular shame of a man who knows he has not, himself, been very solid. Mabel picked the shirt back up. Her throat did something complicated. "Thank you, Papa," she said. And that was, for both of them, enough. Not. The summer pushed forward. The heat settled in. And Cole Mercer's name and Mabel Rowan's name got said together in Red Hollow with increasing frequency, and with the particular tone that a town uses when it has decided something is happening and has divided itself on whether the happening is a scandal or a tragedy, or simply a very strange story. Darlene Fitch had moved into the tragedy camp, where she held court with energy and certainty. "He'll regret it," she said, more than once. "A man with that kind of property, making that kind of decision. He just doesn't see it yet." Clara Voss, who had privately decided that a man who turned her down without apparent difficulty was probably not worth the energy of sustained dislike, said less, but she said it in ways that added up. The ranch hands on the neighboring properties had their own vocabulary for it. Cruder, less concerned with propriety, more concerned with the specific kind of male confusion that manifests as mockery when you don't know what else to do with something you don't understand. Cole heard it. You couldn't live in a settlement of 200 souls and not hear things. He heard it, and he did not react visibly, which made the people saying things more frustrated than silence would have, because the point of saying such things was generally to provoke a response, and a man who gave you nothing was a man you couldn't win against. Mabel heard it too. She always heard it. She was very practiced at hearing things while appearing not to. But something was different now, some minor tectonic shift in the internal landscape, because the things she was hearing now felt different from how they used to feel. Not painless. She'd have been lying to herself to say they didn't land, but they landed differently. They landed on ground that had something underneath it now, some bedrock she hadn't had before. Like water under shale, she thought, more than once. Still there, just harder to reach than people thought. In August, Cole came to the laundry with no washing and no injured body part, and no specific question about geological surveys. He came at the end of the afternoon, when the light was going golden through the one good window, and Mabel was finishing the last of the day's work and thinking about what she was going to make her father for supper from a pantry that was running thinner than she liked. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'd like to keep seeing you," he said. Proper. Formal. Whatever that means here. Mabel set down the shirt she was folding, picked it up again, set it down. "Cole," she said, "people think—" "I know what people think. They think you've made a mistake. Then they're wrong." Flat, certain, not loud. She looked at him. He was standing in the door frame with the evening light behind him and his hat in his hand, and that expression of someone who has made up his mind and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "I'm not easy," she said. "I don't—" She stopped. "I don't make things easy. I have opinions about things, and I say them, and I'm not going to stop doing that because it's more comfortable for everyone." "I know," he said. "I've noticed. My father is a problem that doesn't have a solution. I know that too. And I'm not—" She stopped again. This was the part she'd been bracing herself for, the part she'd been carrying for years like a stone in a pocket, and she made herself say it directly because she had decided a long time ago that the only way she was going to survive Red Hollow was by refusing to pretend. "I know what I look like. I know what people think when they look at me. And I'm not going to be a project, Cole. I'm not going to be someone's good deed." He crossed the floor in 4 steps and stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly. "Look at me," he said. She did. "I'm not a good deed kind of man," he said. "Ask anyone in this town. They'll tell you that much is true." Something shifted in her chest. "I'm asking you," he said, "to let this be what it is. Not what anyone else says it is. What it actually is." The laundry was very quiet. Outside, someone's horse was making noise at the hitching post. Somewhere in the distance, a child was calling something to another child, the words unclear. "All right," Mabel said. Cole exhaled. "All right," he said. He walked back to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Supper," he said. "Sunday, at the ranch." It wasn't a question. "Sunday," she said. He touched his hat brim, and he left, and the door swung shut behind him, and Mabel stood alone in the fading light of the laundry with her hand pressed flat on the counter like she needed something solid to press against. Outside, she knew someone had seen. Someone was already talking. Let them, she thought. Let them talk all they wanted. The springs were still there. 20 feet down, behind the shale. She'd known it for years, and she knew it still, and that particular knowledge had nothing to do with what anyone else in Red Hollow believed about it. The water was real. It didn't need their permission to be real. Sunday came with the kind of sky that looked innocent and wasn't. Pale blue, going white at the edges, the heat already building before 7 in the morning. Mabel walked the 2 miles to Cole's ranch because she didn't own a horse, and because asking her father to borrow the mule would have required an explanation she wasn't ready to give twice in 1 week. She wore her good dress, which was dark blue and fit her honestly, and her good boots, and she carried nothing because she had nothing worth carrying to a place like this. Cole's ranch was not impressive in the way that wealth is impressive. It was impressive in the way that hard work is. Everything functional, nothing wasted, the fence line straight, and the barn roof patched with materials that didn't match but held. The house itself was 2 rooms and a porch, built from timber that had weathered unevenly so that the south-facing wall was darker than the rest. There was a kitchen garden on the east side that needed weeding but had been watered recently, and August was in the small paddock near the barn, watching her arrival with the dignified indifference of a horse who has seen enough visitors to have opinions about them. Cole was on the porch when she came up the track. He'd cooked. She could smell it from 20 feet out. Something with onions and something with coffee. And he looked like a man who had put more effort into a meal than he was comfortable admitting. "You walked," he said. "It's not far." He looked at her for a moment with that assessment she'd gotten used to, the one that was not unkind. "Next time I'll come for you." She didn't argue. She stepped up onto the porch and they stood there for a moment with the plains spread out to the east and the canyon rim to the west, and the whole particular silence of a ranch at mid-morning, which is different from the silence of a town in ways that are difficult to explain but immediately felt. "It's good land," she said, meaning it. "It's difficult land," he said, but yes." They ate at the small table inside with the window open for the breeze that didn't quite arrive. Cole had made salt pork and beans with cornbread, which was simple and honest, and there was coffee strong enough to offend. And Mabel ate without self-consciousness for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. Because Cole ate the same way he did everything else, straightforwardly, without ceremony, without looking at her plate. "I've been thinking about the springs," he said, after a while. "So have I." Equipment would be the problem. A good drill rig costs money I don't have on hand. Pick work would take longer, and I'd need extra men, which also costs money. He tore off a piece of cornbread. But if the channel runs where you say it does, a successful dig would mean year-round water access. I could expand the herd, move cattle through the canyon route you mapped in dry season when the main road turns to dust. "You'd need to bring the other East Canyon ranchers in," she said. "Pedersen and the Harlow brothers further north. Share the cost, share the access." Pedersen's agreeable. The Harlows are a different question. They're practical men. Show them the survey data and the water location, and they'll agree. People don't make irrational decisions when the numbers are clear. Cole looked at her across the table. "Most people aren't rational when there's money involved." "Most people haven't read what I've read," she said, which came out more certain than she'd intended, but she didn't walk it back. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, a shift at the corner of his mouth, but she caught it. "No," he said, "they haven't." That was the Sunday that Red Hollow later pointed to when it was looking back as the moment things became official. Not because anything official happened. There was no declaration, no formal arrangement made, but Mabel walked home in the afternoon heat with the sensation of having been in a place where the air was different, and Cole stood on his porch watching the track after she'd gone, and the 15 people who happened to see one or the other of them in the hours that followed reported, independently and in their own ways, that something had changed in the set of both their faces. The gossip shifted register after that. It had been speculative before. Now it was certain, and certainty gave it a different kind of energy, sharper, less curious, more invested in outcomes. Darlene Fitch threw a supper party the following Friday and did not invite Cole, which was itself a statement, and spent the better part of the evening providing her guests with careful analysis of the situation. "He's isolated himself," she said, refilling wine glasses with the particular generosity of someone who wants people to stay long enough to hear everything. "From the community that could have supported him. You'll see. When the season turns hard, and it always does, he'll have no one to call on." She paused. "And she'll be no help at all." Two ranch hands who worked for the Harlow brothers, young men named Jessup and Ford, who had the specific cruelty of people who've never been tested by anything that mattered, started making comments when they passed Cole in town. Nothing direct enough to require a direct response, just the steady erosion of small slights, the kind designed to build up over time. They called him Rowan's man, which was meant to diminish him in a way that would have required explaining if they'd been asked to explain it, and which diminished only them. Cole heard it. He didn't respond. He had the economy of a man who conserved his energy for things worth spending it on, and Jessup and Ford were not things worth spending it on. What he did respond to, and more directly than anyone expected, was the Tuesday morning when he walked into the Mercantile and found Mabel at the counter, waiting for her order to be filled, while behind her two women, one of whom was Clara Voss, conducted a conversation clearly meant to be heard. The topic, loosely framed, was the declining standards of good sense in the modern cowboy, with particular reference to men who couldn't distinguish between genuine worth and obvious desperation. Cole walked through the door, took in the situation, and did not stop walking. He went to the counter, stood beside Mabel, and said, at a volume that reached every corner of the room, "I'm sorry to keep you waiting." Mabel looked up at him. "I had a question for the Harlow brothers this morning," he continued, the same normal voice, as if the two women behind them were furniture. "Took longer than expected. Are you ready?" "My order isn't filled yet," she said carefully. "We'll wait," he said. And he stood there, right there beside her, with his arms crossed, and his expression the particular blank patience of a man who has nowhere else he needs to be, while the Mercantile finished her order and wrapped it, and the room went through the careful adjustments of people who have been seen doing something they'd rather not be seen doing. Clara Voss said nothing more, She left quickly, with the particular purpose of a woman who has remembered an urgent errand. Outside, Mabel walked 2 steps ahead of him before she stopped. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I came to meet you." "Cole." "What?" She turned to look at him. He met her eyes without flinching. "Thank you," she said quietly. He gave her the small nod of a man who had heard what she meant and didn't need to make a production of it. They walked up the main street of Red Hollow together, not touching, not hurrying, taking up their ordinary separate space in the world. And the town, which had arranged itself in windows and doorways with the reflex of a place that understood spectacle, watched them go and began almost immediately the work of processing what it had just seen. The heat climbed through August, the grass went yellow-gray. Cole's cattle were managing, but the water situation, always a negotiation in a Texas summer, was tightening, and he made the trip to the Harlow brothers' property on a Thursday that was hot enough to blister paint. The Harlows were 2 men built from the same general template, broad, weathered, with the careful suspicion of ranchers who had been offered things before and found the offering concealed hooks. The elder, Davis, was 50 and deliberate. The younger Tom was 43 and faster with his opinions. They sat on the Harlow porch while the heat shimmered off the flat land, and Cole laid out the survey information that Mabel had helped him organize into something presentable. The geological report, her mapped calculations, the estimated depth of the shale break. Davis Harlow looked at the papers for a long time. This came from the Rowan girl? Mabel Rowan worked the calculations. The source data is County Survey, 1871. The County Survey, Tom said, with the tone of a man looking for reasons, from 15 years ago. The geology doesn't change in 15 years, Cole said. Water's still there. Survey said so then. Her calculations confirm it now. Tom exchanged a look with his brother that Cole was not meant to miss, and that Cole met with total stillness. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Cole said. "Come to the canyon. Put your hand on the north wall. Hear it yourself." "You can hear it?" Davis asked. "She showed me how." Tom's jaw worked. "You're staking this on what the Rowan girl says she heard in a rock wall." Cole looked at him steadily. "I'm staking it on a geological survey, 12 years of water behavior in this region that matches her model exactly, and the fact that she has read more about the hydrology of this canyon than you or I or anyone in Red Hollow will ever bother to." A pause. "But sure, call it the rock wall if that's easier." The silence on the Harlow porch had a specific quality. Davis looked at his brother. His brother looked at his boots. "We'd want to see the survey," Davis said finally. "I have a copy." Cole produced it from the roll he'd carried from his saddlebag. "Keep it." Davis took it, read the relevant sections with the slow thoroughness of a man who wouldn't be hurried, nodded once. "We'll come to the canyon," he said. "Saturday." They came. Mabel was not there. Cole had not asked her to be, partly because he suspected her presence would give Tom Harlow something to focus his resistance on, and partly because he felt the specific protectiveness of a man who does not want to watch someone be dismissed in front of him when he can prevent it. He brought the survey instead, and the location she'd marked, and the memory of her voice explaining the shale depth with the particular confidence of someone who has run the numbers 6 times. Davis Harlow put his hand on the canyon wall at the marked point and held it there, and after about 30 seconds said, "I'll be damned," quietly, with conviction. Tom Harlow put his hand on the wall and held it longer and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. They agreed to cost-share the dig. Pedersen agreed the following week in about 4 minutes, which was his way. Cole came to the laundry that afternoon and told Mabel. She was ironing. She set the iron down on the trivet and looked at him. "All 3 of them," she said. Davis Harlow had to feel it himself, but yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tom Harlow's going to be a problem further down." Cole blinked. He agreed. He agreed because Davis agreed and because you pushed him into a corner. That's a different thing from actually believing in it. She picked the iron back up. "Watch him. He'll be agreeable until he has a reason not to be." Cole looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You've never met Tom Harlow." "I've done his washing for 3 years," she said, "and his wife's, and I've watched him in town." She moved the iron in a careful arc. "Men like Tom Harlow don't change their minds. They just change who they say is responsible when things go wrong. Cole was quiet for a moment. I'll watch him, he said. Good. He stayed another 20 minutes, helping her fold sheets because she hadn't asked him to, and because he apparently had decided this was something he could be useful at, which he was, in a methodical, unself-conscious way. They worked in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who had gotten past the stage where silence required management. People are saying the dig won't work, Mabel said at one point. People are saying a lot of things. Darlene Fitch told Agnes Beaumont that you'd bankrupted yourself on a fool's errand. She said it without heat, the way you say a weather report. Agnes told the Voss girl. Agnes tells everything to the Voss girl, Cole said, shaking out a sheet. The difference now, Mabel said, is that if the dig fails, they'll say I put you up to it, and that will be the story. She folded her end with precision. I want you to know I understand that. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not under any illusion about how it works. Cole took the folded sheet and set it on the pile. If the dig fails, he said, it fails because we tried something difficult and it didn't work. That's the only version of that story I'm going to accept. She looked at him. And it's not going to fail, he said. It was the most certainty she'd heard from him about something this uncertain, and it landed differently than optimism usually did, because Cole Mercer was not a man who trafficked in optimism. He dealt in assessment. He dealt in probability. Hearing certainty from him about this particular thing, about her particular thing, did what few things in Mabel Rowan's adult life had done. It made her believe him. The dig began in September. It was brutal work in the September heat. 4 men on rotation with picks and a borrowed drill mechanism that broke twice in the first week and had to be repaired by Cole and Pedersen in a process that involved a great deal of wire and language that would have offended the church-going community. Tom Harlow sent his foreman in his own place, which was not the agreement, and Cole noted it without comment and worked around it. Mabel came to the canyon on the second day, not to watch, but to recheck her calculations against the actual exposed rock face as the dig progressed. She brought the survey. She brought the notes she'd been keeping for 2 years in a worn composition book that she hadn't shown anyone. She stood at the work site with dried clay on her boots and studied the rock layers as they came up. And when the crew hit a section of shale that ran deeper than predicted, she was the one who identified the lateral weakness, a seam running diagonally through the face. That meant they could angle the dig rather than fight the shale straight on. The foreman Harlow had sent, a man named Breck, watched this with open skepticism. You trust the woman's reading on this? He asked Cole, not quietly. Cole was sweating through his shirt and had blood on his left knuckle from the drill repair and had been awake since 4 in the morning. He looked at Breck with the specific patience of a man at the end of a long day who has one nerve left and is deciding whether to use it. She's been right every time so far, Cole said. You got a counter reading? Breck didn't. Then yes, Cole said. I trust her reading. They angled the dig. They hit water on the 4th day. Not the full channel yet, just seepage, but seepage in the right place at the right depth, confirming the trajectory. Cole was at the dig site when it happened, and he came to find Mabel that evening with dry mud cracking at his collar and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. You were right, he said. She was standing in her kitchen making her father's supper, and she turned from the stove and looked at him in the doorway. I know, she said. And then, more quietly, I know. Cole stood there for a moment. He looked tired in a way that was good, the tiredness of something worth doing. His hands were wrecked, calloused over calluses, with fresh cuts that crossed old scars. The channel runs exactly where you said, he told her. Another 2 days, maybe 3, and we'll have open flow. Mabel turned back to the stove because she needed somewhere to look. Good, she said. That's good. Behind her, she heard him shift his weight, heard the exhale of a man who'd been carrying something heavy. Mabel. Come see it when it opens. She stirred the pot. I'll come. He left, and her father shuffled in from the other room asking if supper was ready, and the evening went on the way evenings do, ordinary and relentless and completely unaware of what it was interrupting. But that night, after her father was in bed, and the house was quiet, and the heat had finally started to come off the land, Mabel sat at the kitchen table with her composition book open in front of her, looking at the maps she'd drawn, the calculations she'd run over and over in the years when no one was asking. The water was real. She'd known it for 2 years, alone, in a town that didn't ask. Now someone had gone into the ground after it, with their hands, because she'd said it was there. She closed the composition book. She put it on the shelf where she kept the almanacs and the county reports and the geological survey from 1871 that nobody had wanted. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Outside, Red Hollow was settling into its nighttime self. Dogs and distant voices, and the particular creak of timber contracting in the cooling air. In the morning, it would wake up and be itself again, with all its judgments and its certainties and its story about what kind of woman Mabel Rowan was. But the water was real, and it was coming up, and the town was going to have to find something new to say. The water came up on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. There was no geyser, no sudden rush that announced itself with theater. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more powerful for it. Cole was at the dig face at 6 in the morning when the pick broke through the last section of shale, and the seepage that had been building for 2 days became something else entirely. A steady, pressured flow that rose up through the channel and spread dark across the canyon floor, cold and clear in a way that groundwater is cold and clear, the particular quality of water that has been traveling through stone for a very long time. Pedersen, who was standing 3 feet back, said something in Norwegian that Cole didn't understand but recognized as the tone of a man who has just seen something he didn't entirely believe was possible. Cole stood there with the pick in his hands and the water rising around his boots, and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he sent a boy into town with a message for Mabel. She came within the hour, still in her work apron, with her composition book under her arm because she hadn't thought to leave it. She stood at the canyon edge and looked down at the water spreading across the floor below, and her face did something that Cole watched carefully. Not the small, contained movements he'd gotten used to reading, but something that broke through all that careful management. Not tears, just an expression that had no armor in it, no protection, pure and unguarded for about 4 seconds before she pulled it back under control. She looked at Cole. 22 feet, she said. 22 and a half. Close enough. She looked back at the water. The flow rate will increase as the channel clears. You'll have full pressure by the end of the week. I know, he said. She nodded once, brisk and businesslike, and opened her composition book and started making notes, and Cole looked at the side of her face while she wrote, and felt something he had no particular name for settle into place in his chest like a timber finding its joint. The water reached the surface channel by Friday and was running clear into the collection basin they'd roughed out by Sunday. Pedersen shook Cole's hand so hard it left his palm red. Even Davis Harlow came to look, standing at the canyon rim with his hat in his hand and an expression of a man recalculating several things at once. Tom Harlow didn't come. Mabel had been right about that too. What Tom Harlow did instead was begin, quietly, the kind of campaign that doesn't announce itself as a campaign. He talked to his foreman. His foreman talked to the other hands. And the version of events that began circulating in the saloon and at the feed store was subtly, carefully different from what had actually happened. Less about the water itself, which was undeniable, and more about the terms of the shared access agreement, which Tom claimed had never been finalized to his satisfaction. I never agreed to the North Channel allocation, he told Davis, on a Tuesday evening that Cole was not present for. Davis looked at his brother. You were there when Cole drew the map. I was there. I never signed anything. Cole's word and a dead woman's survey notes, Tom said. That's what we're operating on. The phrase dead woman's survey notes was deliberate. The geological surveyor who'd written the 1871 report had in fact died years ago, and Tom had apparently decided this detail was useful. I'm not saying the water isn't there. I'm saying the arrangement was never settled properly. Pedersen heard about this through his wife, who'd heard it from the hardware clerk, and he came to Cole's ranch on a Thursday morning with the look of a man delivering bad news he'd rather not be delivering. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. He's going to push for renegotiation, Pedersen said at the end. I know what he's going to do, Cole said. If he takes it to arbitration, he won't. Cole was quiet for a moment, turning something over. He wants leverage, not arbitration. Arbitration means everything gets examined. He doesn't want that. He looked at Pedersen. He wants me to come to him. And I won't. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. This is about the Rowan question, not the water allocation. Pedersen was quiet. He was not by nature a man who navigated social complexity with any particular grace, but he was honest, which was better. Some of the hands have been saying things, he said carefully, about you, about Mabel. I know what they've been saying. It's getting worse since the water came up. Pedersen turned his hat in his hands. Like it made them angrier, like they expected it to fail, and now they're annoyed that it didn't, Cole said. Yes. Cole looked out the window at the East Range, where the grass was already showing the benefit of extended water access. Just barely, just the beginning of a difference, but visible to someone who'd been watching the land long enough. Let them be annoyed, he said. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had decided not to carry other people's feelings for them, which was easy to say and considerably harder to sustain when the town was the size of Red Hollow, and you had to look at those feelings every time you needed flour or a farrier. But he sustained it. That was the thing about Cole Mercer that the people who dismissed him had consistently underestimated. He was not stubborn in the reactive way, the way that was really just pride in disguise. He was stubborn in the structural way, the kind that doesn't require daily maintenance, that runs quietly beneath everything and doesn't call attention to itself until the moment it matters. October came in dry. Not just dry, the particular ominous dry that old-timers in Red Hollow recognized and talked about in the shorthand of people who'd seen it before. The sky went pale at the edges in the late afternoon in a way that meant the moisture was leaving it. The creek that ran through the center of town dropped 6 inches in 2 weeks. The cattle on the West Range started moving, which cattle do before people understand why. And then the drought arrived properly, with the blunt indifference of weather that has no interest in anyone's plans. It was not the worst drought the territory had seen, but it was bad enough. By the 3rd week of October, the creek was a series of disconnected pools. The wells in the lower quarter of town were dropping. The late-season hay crop failed on 2 properties, which meant feed costs that most ranchers in Red Hollow were not positioned to absorb. And into this particular moment of collective anxiety, a man named Silas Croft rode into Red Hollow on a gray horse with a letter of introduction from a cattle brokerage out of San Antonio. Silas Croft was 55 and had the kind of face that looked trustworthy in the way that certain tools look simple. Clean lines, nothing extraneous, giving no indication of the complexity of their mechanism. He wore good clothes that were not showy, which was itself a calculation. He took a room at the boarding house, ate 2 meals a day at the same table in the corner of the dining room, and within 4 days had introduced himself to every property owner within 15 miles of Red Hollow. His proposition was straightforward, which should have been the first warning sign, and wasn't, because people in difficult circumstances have a powerful appetite for straightforward. He was representing a San Antonio syndicate, he said, that was acquiring cattle from drought-affected regions at above-market rates, buying now, before the animals lost more condition, which benefited the seller. Payment in 30 days. Clean transaction. The above-market rate, he quoted, was 14% above the current price. 14%, Pedersen said to Cole when he brought the news. On a full herd. For me, that's the difference between a bad year and a year I can't recover from. Cole had the Croft letter in his hands. He read it twice. Then he turned it over and read the back, which was blank, in the way that a man checks the back of something when the front is bothering him. Who's the syndicate? He asked. Garfield and Associates, San Antonio. You know them? I don't know anyone in San Antonio, Pedersen said with the reasonable defensiveness of a man who had never been to San Antonio. Cole folded the letter. I want to talk to Croft. He's at the boarding house. Not there. Cole thought for a moment. Get him to come here. To the ranch. I want to see how he handles the approach. Pedersen looked uncertain. Cole, you're not signing anything until I've talked to him. I didn't say, Huck. Cole looked at him steadily. You came here before you went to his room. That means something in you isn't settled. I'm asking you to give me 1 day. Pedersen was quiet. Then he nodded. Silas Croft came to the Mercer Ranch the following afternoon, and he came with the easy sociability of a man who has done 100 of these meetings and knows exactly how they go. He shook Cole's hand, admired the water access setup with what seemed like genuine appreciation, accepted coffee, and sat across the table with the relaxed posture of someone who was not worried about this particular conversation. Cole let him talk for 10 minutes, which was enough to hear the whole proposition again and to watch the way Croft delivered it. The small emphases, the casual mentions of other ranchers who'd already agreed, the gentle references to how quickly conditions could deteriorate if a man waited too long to act. The 30-day payment window, Cole said when Croft paused. What triggers the disbursement? Croft smiled. Transfer of custody of the herd to our transport team. And if there's a dispute about condition rating at transfer? The syndicate's assessor does the rating. Standard practice. Standard practice for the syndicate, Cole said. Not necessarily standard for the seller. A brief pause. Croft's smile didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. Mr. Mercer, I can assure you the syndicate has completed dozens of these transactions without... I'm sure they have. Cole set his coffee cup down. I want to see the syndicate's registration with the state, and the names of 3 sellers from their last acquisition round who I can write to directly. Silence. It was a short silence. Croft recovered it quickly. That's an unusual request at this stage of the conversation. It's a straightforward one, Cole said. If the syndicate is legitimate, those things exist and you can provide them. Croft leaned back slightly. The sociability was still there, but it was performing more effort now. I don't carry registration documents on a first visit. Then come back when you do. Croft looked at Cole for a moment with an expression that was making calculations. Then he nodded, collected his hat, and made his exit with the smooth grace of a man who had encountered resistance before and knew that resistance was not necessarily the end of a negotiation, just the beginning of a different approach. Cole sat at the table after he'd gone and looked at the empty coffee cup across from him. He went to find Mabel that evening. She was in the vegetable garden, doing the last of the autumn harvest with the focus of someone trying to get everything out before the first frost. She looked up when she heard him on the path and registered his face with the directness that had become, he'd realized, one of the things he relied on most. She never gave him the diluted version of her attention. Croft, she said before he spoke. You've heard. Everyone's heard. He's been to most of the ranches east of the road. She stood, brushing soil from her hands. What did he say? Cole told her. All of it, including the registration question and Croft's response. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he had come to appreciate the way you appreciate a good tool, the absence of unnecessary friction. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the last of the bean plants. The 30-day window is the mechanism, she said. I think so too. He takes custody at transfer, 30 days to pay. But if there's a condition dispute, the syndicate's own assessor decides. So he takes your cattle now, rates them low at transfer, and the payment on day 30 is far less than what was agreed. She looked at Cole. If you argue it, the syndicate's in San Antonio, and your cattle are with them. What are you going to do? Ride 400 miles to dispute an assessor's paperwork? Cole was quiet. He's done it before, Mabel said, with ranches in drought situations specifically. Distressed sellers, people who need the money now and can't afford to wait or fight. How do you know that? She went inside and came back with a newspaper, not the Red Hollow Weekly, which wouldn't have covered anything this far from home, but one of the San Antonio papers that came in on the mail coach every few weeks, months late, which most people in Red Hollow used to line shelves. She'd kept them. She found the section a small item, not the front page, the kind of business reporting that hides in the middle of papers where nobody looks, and handed it to Cole. He read it in the fading light. Garfield and Associates had been cited in 2 separate county disputes in the previous 18 months over fraudulent condition assessments. No criminal finding, just disputes settled quietly with amounts that were never published. You kept this, Cole said. I keep everything, she said. You know that. He did know that. He looked at the article for another moment. The problem, he said slowly, is that he's already got most of the town moving toward yes. Pedersen's close, Davis Harlow's close. The smaller ranchers in the West Quarter don't have another option. They're hurting too badly to turn down 14% over market. They won't get 14%, Mabel said. They don't know that yet. Then someone needs to tell them. She took the newspaper back. Before they sign. Croft will call it speculation. He'll say it's one disputed report and it doesn't mean anything. Then you need something stronger than a newspaper. She was thinking now with the quality of concentration he'd seen at the canyon wall. That deep, focused attention, like everything else had gone quiet. The sellers from his last round, you asked him for names. He didn't give them, which means they exist and he doesn't want you talking to them. She looked at him. Cole, who do you know in the county seat? He thought. Judge Hardcastle, from the circuit. Does Hardcastle have access to state registration records for cattle brokers? A pause. He might, Cole said. Get to him before Croft does. If Garfield and Associates has a registration history with the state, the complaint record is attached. That's public information. Cole looked at her. She was standing in her kitchen garden in the October light with soil on her hands and a 3-year-old newspaper under her arm, and she had just mapped, in about 4 minutes, a course of action that would have taken him a week to arrive at on his own, if he'd arrived at it at all. I'd have to ride to the county seat tomorrow, he said. Then ride tomorrow. He nodded slowly. Then he said, There's the other problem. She waited. Even if I get the Hardcastle connection, even if the registration record shows what we think it shows. He paused. Most of the ranches in the East Canyon, the ones Pedersen and I were planning to run the canyon route through, they're the same ones that are closest to signing with Croft. If they sell their herds, there's no cattle to move through the route. The whole water access plan becomes theoretical. Mabel absorbed this. And you, she said, what does your situation look like? Cole was quiet for a moment, with the honesty of a man who does not like saying certain things out loud. The dig cost more than I'd planned. The drought has me on short feed. If the other ranchers sell out and the canyon route fails, I don't have the volume to make the water investment pay. He looked at her steadily. I'd probably have to sell the east acreage. Maybe more. The garden was very quiet. A crow landed on the fence post at the far end of the vegetable plot and regarded them both with the profound indifference of something that has no stake in human difficulty. Mabel looked at the crow. Then she looked back at Cole. I have a plan, she said. He waited. Part of it is going to sound wrong to you at first, she said, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you say no. Cole crossed his arms, not in resistance. It was his listening posture she'd figured out, the way he stabilized himself when he was paying close attention. Go ahead, he said. She told him. It took about 15 minutes, and she laid it out in the careful, sequential way she laid everything out. The canyon routes she'd mapped years ago that nobody had asked about. The northern trading connection through the Cimarron Pass that the old wagon maps showed, and the new road system had made everyone forget about. The timing of the fall drives that meant bypassing the main broker market entirely and moving cattle directly to the northern settlements that were not in drought and were actively looking for supply. The risk was the terrain. The canyon route she was proposing had not been used as a cattle road in at least 15 years. It was passable. She'd walked sections of it more than once, but passable for a person on foot and passable for a herd of cattle were different propositions. The shale ledge on the north section is the problem, she said. But if the water access holds, we can rest the herd at the canyon floor before the ledge section and move them through in 2 groups early morning before the heat. She paused. The northern settlements will pay 12% above San Antonio market for guaranteed delivery this season. I wrote to 2 of them last week. Cole stared at her. You wrote... He stopped. When did you write them? After you told me about Croft's first visit to Pedersen. She met his eyes without apology. I needed to know if there was a market before I brought the plan to you. I didn't want to offer you a theory. A long moment. 12%, he said, against Croft's 14. Against Croft's real number, which is probably 6 or 7 after the condition dispute. Maybe less. She reached into her apron pocket and produced 2 letters, folded, with county seals on the envelope backs. These arrived this morning. Cole took them, read the first one, read the second. The crow had departed from the fence post at some point. Neither of them had noticed it go. He folded the letters carefully. The canyon ledge section, he said. How long to move a herd through? 3 hours in good conditions. Maybe 4. Weather window? We have 2 weeks before the first serious frost closes the pass. She paused. It has to be this month. He was quiet for a long time. The deep quiet of a man doing serious arithmetic. Not just numbers. The whole thing. Risk, terrain, trust, The faces of the men he'd need to convince to follow a route that a woman in a kitchen garden had mapped from old wagon charts and county surveys nobody else had wanted to read. He knew what the town would say. He knew what Tom Harlow would say, and what Breck the foreman would say, and what Darlene Fitch would say when the story reached her parlor. He knew all of that, and he looked at Mabel Rowan standing in October light with her soil-stained hands and her 2 letters and her 15 years of reading things nobody else wanted, and he made his decision with the same quality of stillness that he brought to every decision that actually mattered. "I need to ride to the county seat tomorrow," he said, "and I need you to come with me." She blinked. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who knows what we're looking for in the registration records, and because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I'm not doing this without you in the room." It was, for Cole Mercer, a long speech. Mabel looked at him for a moment. "My father, Mrs. Pedersen will check on him. She already told Huck she would." Mabel stared. "You planned this before you came here." "I planned half of it," he said. "You planned the other half. That's how this works." The October light was going fast now, the sky going that particular deep orange that meant a cold night was coming. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were moving, the low, constant sound of a herd unsettled by drought. Mabel folded the letters back into her pocket. She looked at the vegetable garden for a moment, at the last of the season's work. "Early," she said. "We leave early." "First light," Cole said. She nodded. And the decision that Red Hollow would later call reckless, foolish, and a dozen other things that all meant we didn't think it would work, that decision was made in a kitchen garden in October, between 2 people standing in failing light, each one betting everything on the other's judgment. The town didn't know it yet, but by morning they would be gone. They rode out before the town woke up. The county seat was a 4-hour ride east on a good day, and October had decided not to give them a good day. The sky at first light had that flat, yellowish quality that meant weather was building somewhere west of them, and the wind came in low and persistent off the canyon, the kind that worked its way through coat seams and didn't apologize for it. Mabel rode Pedersen's spare mare, a solid, unexciting animal named Grace, who had the virtue of being reliable if not inspired, and Cole rode August, and they put Red Hollow behind them in the dark with nobody watching. For the first hour neither of them spoke much, which was not uncomfortable. The land east of Red Hollow was different from the canyon country, flatter, more exposed, with the particular loneliness of plains that go on past what the eye can process. Mabel watched it go past and thought about the registration records and the complaint history and the exact wording of the 2 letters in her pocket, which she had already memorized. "You're rehearsing something," Cole said, without looking at her. "The argument for Hardcastle," she said. "I want to have it organized before we get there." "Hardcastle's a reasonable man. Reasonable men still need a clear case." She paused. "You know him better than I do. How does he respond to a woman presenting evidence?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Depends on how it's presented." "That's not an answer." "He's fair," Cole said, which was not quite an answer either, but it was honest, which she appreciated more. "I'll need you to let me lead," she said. "In the room, with the records." Another pause. "All right. You'll want to correct me at certain points," she said. "Don't." She felt him look at her sideways. "You expect me to be wrong?" "I expect you to have opinions," she said. "Which is different. I've thought this through more than you have, and if Hardcastle sees us disagreeing in front of him, it undercuts everything." Cole was quiet long enough that she thought he might push back. He didn't. "Lead," he said simply. They arrived at the county seat by mid-morning and went directly to the courthouse, where Judge Hardcastle was not presiding over anything urgent and was in his office reading a brief with the expression of a man deeply unhappy about what the brief contained. He was a broad, gray man with a permanent furrow between his brows that suggested he had been unhappy about documents for most of his adult life. And he looked up when Cole knocked and registered Mabel's presence with a brief, professional neutrality that told her he was at least trying to be fair. "Mercer," he said, "this is unexpected." "I apologize for coming without writing first," Cole said. "There wasn't time." Hardcastle looked at Mabel. "Miss Rowan," she said, "I do washing for several families in Red Hollow, including yours." Something shifted in Hardcastle's expression, not warmth exactly, but recognition, the reassessment of someone who has placed you in a different category than the one you arrived in. "Sit down," he said. She laid it out. All of it. The Croft proposition, the terms of the agreement, the condition assessment mechanism, the newspaper item about the San Antonio complaints, and what she believed the complaint records attached to Garfield and Associates' state registration would show. She was concise, and she was specific, and she didn't apologize for knowing what she knew. Cole sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Hardcastle listened with his hands folded on the desk, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You read the San Antonio papers," he said. "I read whatever comes through the mail coach." The complaints against Garfield were civil disputes. No criminal finding. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for a criminal proceeding. I'm asking for access to the broker registration record so that the ranchers in Red Hollow who are considering this agreement can see the full complaint history before they sign." She paused. "That's public information." "It is," Hardcastle agreed. He looked at Cole. "This is what you came for?" "This is what we came for," Cole said. Hardcastle stood and went to his filing cabinet with the unhurried movement of a man who has already decided and is simply executing. He pulled a folder, found the relevant registration, and set it on the desk in front of Mabel. The complaint history was 3 pages. She read all 3 pages, which took about 4 minutes, in silence that Hardcastle and Cole both occupied without impatience. 5 complaints, she said, not 2. The other 3 were settled before they reached public filing, Hardcastle said. The record shows them because the initial complaint was registered, not because they concluded publicly. The settlement amounts, not public. She looked at the 3 settled cases. The pattern was identical: drought conditions, distressed sellers, condition disputes at transfer, payments significantly below agreed terms. One settlement had been for 40% of the originally contracted price. "Can you copy this?" she asked. Hardcastle copied it himself with deliberate care and signed the copy with his circuit seal, which made it official in a way that a simple transcription wouldn't be. "This won't stop Croft if the ranchers decide to sign anyway," he said, handing it to her. "No," she agreed, "but it changes what they're deciding." They rode back into Red Hollow in the early afternoon with the weather that had been building all morning finally making its intentions clear. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind had picked up from the west with the smell of something serious in it. Not rain. Something drier. The kind of weather that the old ranchers called a wringing out, when the sky took what moisture was left in the land and stripped it. Cole called a meeting at his ranch that evening. Not a formal meeting. He didn't have the standing to call formal meetings. Just word sent to Pedersen and Davis Harlow and 4 of the smaller ranchers from the West Quarter who had the most to lose from Croft's scheme and the least resources to recover if it went wrong. He did not invite Tom Harlow, which was a decision he made deliberately and that Davis Harlow noticed when he arrived and looked around the room. "Tom's not here," Davis said. "Tom made his position clear," Cole said. Davis absorbed this. Mabel stood at the table with the Hardcastle copy in front of her, and the 2 letters from the northern settlements and her composition book open to the canyon route maps, and she presented everything with the same directness she'd used with Hardcastle. The ranchers were a harder room than the judge, more afraid, more tired, more suspicious of anything that required them to change direction when they'd already half committed to a course. But they were also men who understood land and water and the arithmetic of drought, and the arithmetic of the complaint history was not complicated. Old Seth Marsh, who had the smallest property of the group and the most to lose, picked up the Hardcastle copy and read it carefully and said, 40% of agreed terms on that last settlement. If that happened to me, I couldn't feed my family through the winter." "It won't happen to you if you don't sign with Croft," Mabel said. "And your plan?" Seth looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who is skeptical but honest about his skepticism. "The canyon route. I've walked it," she said. "Twice in the last 2 years, and once in summer. The shale ledge section is manageable with the right approach. Early morning, 2 groups, rested herd." She opened the composition book to the route map. "The northern settlements have confirmed interest. The price is 12% above current San Antonio market. Not 14, but 12% of what they'll actually pay you. Not 14% of a figure that gets revised at transfer." Seth looked at the map. He was quiet for a long time. "What's the weather window?" he asked. 2 weeks before the pass becomes unreliable, she said. "We'd need to move within 10 days to have margin." More quiet. The room had the specific quality of men doing private arithmetic against their own fear, which is a different kind of math than the kind you do on paper. Davis Harlow said, "I'm in," without drama, just the statement. Pedersen nodded before Davis had finished the sentence. 3 of the 4 smaller ranchers agreed before the evening was out. The fourth, a man named Causey, whose property abutted the Harlow land, said he needed a night to think, which everyone understood to mean he needed to talk to his wife, which was reasonable. He agreed in the morning. Silas Croft left Red Hollow 4 days later with fewer signatures than he'd arrived expecting, and with the specific expression of a man who has encountered an obstacle he didn't fully understand and is recalculating where it came from. He spoke briefly to Tom Harlow before he left, a conversation that took place on the street outside the boarding house, and that several people observed without hearing. Tom Harlow's face during this conversation was the face of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd already decided to believe. The drive preparation began immediately, which meant there was no time for anything to be easy. The first problem was numbers. Pulling together a coordinated drive from 6 separate properties, with cattle in varying condition from the drought, was the kind of logistical challenge that required a level of organization that the ranchers of Red Hollow were not, individually, equipped for. They were good at running their own operations. They were considerably less good at running a shared one. Mabel became, by default, and without anyone exactly deciding this, the person who tracked the numbers. She had a table in Cole's kitchen, the small table where they'd eaten salt pork and beans in August, which felt like a different year, and she worked from it for 3 days straight with the route maps and the herd counts and the provisioning requirements and the timing calculations spread across every available surface. Cole worked the logistics of the actual drive preparation, the equipment, the crew assignments, the water stops, and they met at the table each evening and compared what they knew and adjusted what needed adjusting. It was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was 2 people working very hard in a very small space under genuine pressure, which meant they were short with each other sometimes, and wrong about things sometimes, and had to correct and recorrect. Cole's temper, that impatiently controlled thing, slipped twice, once about a crew assignment he thought she'd misunderstood, and once about the water stop timing on the north section. Both times he caught himself before it became something real, and both times Mabel let it pass without pressing it, not because she was afraid of it, but because she understood the difference between pressure releasing and a pattern, and this was the former. She was not easy either. She was exacting about the route details in a way that some of the hands found difficult because she was specific and she expected the specificity to be followed, and she was not interested in approximations when precision mattered. 2 hours at the canyon floor rest stop, she told Peterson's lead hand, a competent man named Willis, on the second day of preparation. Not 1.5, not when conditions allow. 2 hours, full rest before the ledge section. Willis looked at Cole. 2 hours, Cole said. Willis nodded and went back to work, and Mabel went back to her table and her numbers, and outside the drought continued its patient work on Red Hollow's resources. The storm hit on the night before the drive was scheduled to start. Not rain. That would have been a complicated mercy. What came was wind, the hard, driving, lateral kind that came off the western canyon with enough force to tear the small barn Cole had built for August's feed storage off 2 of its posts and bring the roof down at a 45-degree angle. It hit at 2 in the morning, which was the worst possible hour, and it lasted 3 hours, which was long enough to do significant damage to the drive preparation. Cole and Mabel and Willis and 2 other hands spent the hours from 2 to 5 in the morning in the dark and wind trying to secure what could be secured and accepting the loss of what couldn't. The cattle were spooked. All cattle are spooked by wind of that magnitude, which is their oldest memory of predators moving through grass, and keeping them from scattering across the East Range in the dark was the most urgent problem, and the one that required the most bodies and the most time. By the time the wind dropped, Mabel's canyon route maps were ruined, soaked from a water barrel that had overturned in the barn collapse, and Cole had a gash along his right forearm from a piece of broken fence timber, and the led cattle for the drive were spread across 300 yards of East Range in the pre-dawn dark. They stood in the wreckage of the barn at 5:30 in the morning and looked at each other. Cole's arm was bleeding through the makeshift wrap he'd tied around it, His face was the flat, contained expression of a man taking inventory of a disaster. "The maps," he said. "I have it," she said, touching her temple. "All of it." He looked at her. "I drew those maps 200 times," she said. "I know every foot of that route. The paper doesn't matter." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The herd. Willis and Causey's men are bringing them back. We've got maybe 4 hours before the light is good enough to start the drive and still make the canyon floor by midday." She looked at his arm. "Sit down. Mabel, sit down, Cole." He sat on a section of fallen roof timber and she unwrapped the makeshift bandage and looked at the cut, which was deep enough to need attention and not deep enough to stop the drive, which was the relevant threshold. She cleaned it from the supply kit she'd thought to keep in the main house and not the barn, which was the kind of practical foresight that looked like luck from the outside. "It needs stitching," she said. "Later. Now. It'll be worse in 6 hours." She already had the needle threaded, which told him she'd been carrying it ready, which told him she'd anticipated this or something like it. He held his arm still while she worked, with the set jaw of a man who finds this particular kind of pain easier to endure than admitting he needed help. "Tom Harlow's going to use the storm," she said, while she stitched, focusing on both things at once, the needle and the problem, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing only one thing when two needed doing. "I know." He'll say it's a sign, that the route's too dangerous, that the drive should be canceled and they should go back to the Croft negotiation. "Croft's already left. Tom will find a way to get him back." She tied off the stitch. "He talked to Croft before he left. I don't know what was said, but I know what Tom wants. He wants the shared water access arrangement to fail. If this drive fails, the canyon investment fails, and he can renegotiate from a position where he's the one who didn't lose anything." She looked up. "He'll move today, while everyone's off balance from the storm." Cole looked at his stitched arm. "What do you need from me?" She held his gaze. "I need you to trust the route, completely. No hesitation in front of the other men. If they see you doubt it for 1 second, they'll break." "I trust the route," he said, "and I need you to handle Tom. Whatever he does today, the talking, the maneuvering, I can't be the one to do it. They won't hear it from me." This was the truth, spoken plainly, and they both knew it. Mabel could plan the drive to the inch and be right about every calculation, but if she was the one standing in the yard telling Tom Harlow's network that the canyon route was safe, she'd be dismissed before she finished the sentence. That was Red Hollow's reality, and she was not interested in pretending it wasn't. "I'll handle Tom," Cole said. Tom Harlow arrived at the ranch at 7 in the morning, which confirmed what Mabel had said about timing. He came with Davis, having apparently convinced his brother that family solidarity required his presence, and with the energy of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of moment and is not going to miss his opportunity to use it. "The storm changes things," he said to the assembled group in Cole's yard, a dozen men, tired, some of them still shaking debris off their coats. "A drive through the canyon in these conditions, on a route that's never been used for cattle. The route's been used," Cole said. "Not in 15 years. The terrain doesn't change in 15 years. Cole's voice was level, unhurried. "We've prepped for this. The storm set us back a few hours, that's all." "That's all?" Tom looked around at the other men. "Seth, your south fence came down last night. You've got cattle in 2 counties right now. You call that a few hours?" Seth Marsh looked tired. "We'll have them back before noon. And if you don't? If this drive starts late and the weather turns again on the ledge section, Tom." Cole's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're not on this drive. You didn't agree to it. You didn't contribute to the preparation, and you've been working against it since before it started." A pause. "So with respect, this isn't your decision." The yard went quiet. Tom's face did something complicated. "I'm trying to stop these men from making a catastrophic mistake." "You're trying to stop these men from succeeding without you," Cole said. Still level. Still without heat. "There's a difference, and everyone here knows it." Davis Harlow put his hand briefly on his brother's arm. Tom went quiet. The specific quiet of a man who has used his argument and found it return to him, and who knows that pressing further will only confirm what's just been said about him. The drive started at 9 in the morning, 4 hours later than planned, with a stitched-up trail boss and a woman who carried the route in her head, and no paper maps because the water barrel had seen to those. The cattle were trail-sore and drought-thin and suspicious after the night's storm, and the crew was tired, and the sky to the west was still doing uncertain things that nobody wanted to look at directly. But they moved. Mabel rode at the rear for the first section, which gave her sightlines on the full herd and let her track pace and condition. She was not a drover and made no pretense of being one. She didn't work the cattle directly, didn't carry a prod, didn't have the specific body language that cattle read as authority. What she had was a sense of the route that kept her ahead of problems, and she communicated through Willis, who had learned in the preparation days to translate her assessments into drover language without being asked. The gully at the second bend runs deeper than the map showed, she told Willis at the approach to the canyon entrance. Don't crowd the rear. Give them room to read the ground. Willis adjusted. The cattle took the gully without incident. Cole worked the front of the drive and the middle and the edges, moving constantly with the focused efficiency of a man who has been doing this long enough that most of it was reflex. He checked in with Mabel twice in the first 2 hours. Not hovering, not doubting, just the check-in of someone keeping the full picture. We're 20 minutes behind, she said the second time. Can we make it up on the flat section? 15 minutes of it. We'll still arrive at the canyon floor late. She looked at the sky. The ledge section. I want the first group moving by 3 o'clock at the latest. We'll make 3, he said. They made 3:10, which was close enough. The ledge section was the thing that nobody who hadn't seen it could fully picture from Mabel's descriptions, and that everyone who was seeing it for the first time now understood immediately why she'd spent 2 years thinking about how to move cattle through it. The shale ledge ran along the canyon wall at a point where the floor narrowed to perhaps 40 feet, with the wall rising sheer on one side and a 40-foot drop to the canyon floor on the other. The ledge itself was solid. She'd tested it. But it was narrow enough that the cattle would feel the exposure, and cattle that feel exposure do unpredictable things. She was at the ledge entry when the first group approached, watching the lead animals with the focused attention of someone reading a language most people don't know exists. Slow, she said to Willis. Give the leaders time to smell the path first. Don't push from behind. The first animal stopped at the ledge entry and refused. It stood there for 2 full minutes while the herd behind it compressed with rising anxiety, and Mabel watched it and said nothing, and the men around her watched her and said nothing, and the 2 minutes felt considerably longer than 2 minutes. Then the lead animal stepped onto the ledge, slowly, and moved. The first group went through in 45 minutes. The second group went through in 55, because 3 animals in the rear fought the entry and had to be worked individually by Cole himself, who did it with the patience of a man who has been having honest conversations with cattle for his entire adult life and understands that patience is not optional. By the time the last animal cleared the ledge, the light was going orange, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and everyone on the drive was too tired to celebrate, which was fine. What they did instead was what exhausted people do after something difficult. They sat and drank water and didn't say much, and let the quiet reality of having done it settle in without needing to name it. Cole came to where Mabel was standing at the canyon exit, looking north along the route they still had to travel in the morning. He didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did she. Tomorrow the route opens up, she said. The terrain's easier from here. 2 days to the northern settlements at a reasonable pace. I know, he said. You told me. A pause. Tom's going to have something waiting for us when we get back, she said. Probably, Cole agreed. The water access arrangement. He'll try to leverage the time we've been away. She turned to look at him. He's not done. No, Cole said. He's not. The canyon was settling into its evening sounds. Wind through the upper rock, the distant movement of water they'd helped bring back to this country, the low noise of a tired herd finding its footing on new ground. Cole, she said. He looked at her. There were things she didn't say, things that the situation and the exhaustion and the specific way the light was hitting the canyon wall in that moment made her want to say, and that she didn't, because they were in the middle of something that wasn't finished. Because Tom Harlow was waiting. Because the drive still had 2 days on it, and she never counted anything before it was done. What she said instead was, "You held the line today." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd been learning to read all summer. The one that was not simple, not easy, that had the weight of a man who feels things more deeply than he has language for. So did you, he said. The camp settled into night around them, the cattle quiet at last, the crew asleep in the way that only truly tired people sleep. And Cole and Mabel sat at the edge of the firelight in the canyon that her maps had always promised was passable, that nobody had believed until they were standing inside it, and they did not speak. But the silence between them was the kind that has everything in it, the kind that two people build together out of difficulty and trust, and the specific, uncommon experience of having bet on each other and not been wrong. The northern settlements were 2 days north of the canyon exit, through country that opened up the way hard country sometimes does after it's made its point. Wider sky, less brutal terrain, the grass still holding some color where the drought hadn't reached as deep. The drive moved at a tired but steady pace, and Mabel rode the route from memory with a reliability that Willis had stopped questioning somewhere around the second water stop, when the creek she'd said would be there was there, at the depth she'd estimated, which was close enough. They delivered the herd on a Thursday morning to a settlement called Birch Crossing, where the buyer, a broad practical man named Aldous Fenn, who ran the northern supply operation, met them at the gate with his assessor and did the condition rating on the spot, in front of Cole and the other ranchers, with no private conversations and no mechanisms for dispute. The rating was fair. The price held at 12% above San Antonio market. Aldous Fenn counted out the payments at a table in his office with the methodical care of a man who understood that cash in hand meant something different from a promise in 30 days. And each of the 6 ranchers took their envelope and looked at it for a moment with the particular expression of people who had been genuinely afraid and are now, tentatively, not. Seth Marsh folded his envelope and put it in his inside coat pocket and said quietly, to nobody in particular, "That's a winter." Cole shook Fenn's hand. Fenn looked at Mabel, who was standing slightly apart from the group in the way she'd learned to stand, present but not presuming. "You're the one who mapped the canyon route," Fenn said. It wasn't a question. "I used existing survey data," she said, "and walked it a few times." Fenn looked at her for a moment. "I've had 3 drives try that pass in the last 10 years, he said. "All 3 turned back at the ledge section." He paused. "How'd you get them through?" "Patience," she said, "and 2 hours of rest before the approach." Fenn nodded slowly, with the expression of a man filing information away in a place where he'll actually find it again. "If you're interested in doing it again next season," he said, "I'd pay route planning fees separate from the drive contract." Mabel looked at him steadily. "Write to me in the spring," she said. "Red Hollow, Rowan." He wrote it down. Cole said nothing during this exchange, but she felt him register it the same way she'd learned to feel most things he registered. A small shift, a quality of attention directed briefly at her before returning to the room. They rode back south with lighter saddlebags and something more durable than money, which was the knowledge that the thing had worked. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without the storm and the stitched arm and the 3 animals that had fought the ledge entry and the maps that the water barrel had ruined. But it had worked, and that was the only column that mattered at the end. The ride home was different from the ride out, quieter in a different register. Not the silence of 2 people bracing for something, but the silence of people who have been through something and are still taking stock of what it cost and what it left them with. Cole's arm was healing badly on one side of the stitching, which he hadn't mentioned and which Mabel noticed when his sleeve pulled back at a water crossing on the second day. "Let me look at that," she said. "It's fine." Cole. He stopped August and pulled back his sleeve with the resigned expression of a man who has learned that particular argument is not worth having. The lower section of the stitching had gone red and warm, which was the beginning of infection, and not yet the middle of it, which meant there was still time. "I told you to change the wrap," she said. "I forgot." "You didn't forget. You decided it wasn't important enough to stop for." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She cleaned it from the kit she still carried, which he had still not asked about and which she had still not explained, and she wrapped it tightly and told him to keep the arm below his heart when he wasn't using it, which was impractical advice for a man on horseback, and both of them knew it. "Thank you," he said. "Stop doing things to your arms," she said. He almost smiled, the same small corner of the mouth thing she'd been cataloging since August. She'd gotten good at reading it. They rode into Red Hollow on a Saturday afternoon, and the town was out in the way that small towns are always out when something is coming back that they weren't sure would come back. Not a crowd exactly, Red Hollow didn't do crowds without a specific occasion, but enough people positioned at enough vantage points to constitute, collectively, an audience. The general store, the post office steps, the gap between the livery and the farriers, where Jessup and Ford were leaning against the fence post with the careful nonchalance of men who wanted to see the return without appearing to care about it. Mabel saw all of this from 100 yards out and felt the specific bracing that had become, over her lifetime in this town, as automatic as breathing. What was different now was that the bracing was lighter. Not gone. She was not foolish enough to think that a successful cattle drive through the canyon pass had reorganized Red Hollow's fundamental character, but lighter, the way a weight that hasn't changed becomes easier to carry once your back has gotten stronger. She rode up the main street beside Cole, on the Pedersen mare, in the full view of whatever part of the town had decided to observe, and she did not move to the side or slow down or adjust the angle of her approach. Darlene Fitch was on the general store steps. Her expression as they passed was not the usual composed assessment. It was something she was working harder to control, something complicated that she hadn't fully resolved by the time they were past her. Mabel didn't look away from the road ahead, but she saw it. Tom Harlow was waiting at Cole's ranch. They'd known he would be, or something like it. What they hadn't fully anticipated was that he'd brought a man with him. Not Breck the foreman, not Davis, but a thin, precise-looking individual in town clothes, who introduced himself as a land agent from the county seat, and who had, Tom explained with the contained energy of someone who has been rehearsing this, a set of documents relating to the shared water access agreement that required Cole's signature before the arrangement could be considered legally binding. Cole looked at the documents. Mabel looked at the land agent. "These weren't the terms we discussed," Cole said, turning a page. "The original terms were informal," Tom said. "This formalizes them with appropriate protections for all parties." The appropriate protections, as Mabel read them over Cole's shoulder, allocated water access priority to the Harlow property in drought conditions, which were, notably, the conditions currently in effect, and required the other parties to seek Harlow approval for any expansion of the canyon route. Which meant, functionally, that if Fenn wanted to establish a regular northern drive, Tom Harlow could block it. "No," Cole said. Tom's expression sharpened. "This is standard land agreement language." "I know what it is," Cole said, "and I know what it does." "No." "You're not the only party to this arrangement, Mercer. Pedersen signed." "Pedersen signed what?" Tom produced a second document with the particular satisfaction of someone playing a card they've been holding. Pedersen's signature was at the bottom, with a date from 4 days ago, while they'd been on the drive. Cole looked at it for a moment without expression. Mabel said to the land agent, "Was Mr. Pedersen represented by counsel when he signed this?" The land agent blinked. "That's not a standard requirement. Was he shown the full implication of the drought priority clause before signing?" "Miss Rowan," she said, "did he understand that signing the drought priority clause meant that in a season like this one, which we are currently in, the Harlow property would have first drawn the canyon water, ahead of properties whose herds are larger and whose water need is greater?" The land agent looked at Tom. Tom looked at Mabel with an expression that was several things at once: contempt, calculation, and something newer that she identified as the specific unease of a man who has underestimated a variable in his plan. "Pedersen agreed to the terms," Tom said. "That's his signature." "Then I'll talk to Pedersen," Cole said. "Tonight." "The document is signed, Mercer. You can't—" "I'm not signing this." Cole set the document on the table between them. "And Hardcastle's going to look at it before this goes any further." Tom's jaw tightened. "You think running to Hardcastle every time something doesn't go your way? I think a judge who's seen Garfield and Associates' complaint history is going to find this drought priority clause very interesting reading," Cole said. "Especially since you were the one pushing the Croft negotiation before the drive, and this clause benefits you most if the northern route gets blocked and Croft comes back." Silence. The land agent had gone very still, in the way that professional people go still when they realize they've been brought into something they weren't fully briefed on. "I think we're done for tonight," the land agent said, with the careful neutrality of a man cutting his losses. Tom didn't move immediately. He stood on the far side of Cole's table and looked at Cole, and then, with obvious deliberateness, at Mabel. A look that was not threatening, exactly, but that was meant to communicate something. that she was the problem, that he knew it, that he hadn't finished. Mabel held his gaze without expression, which she was very good at. Tom left. The land agent left with him, and the sound of their horses on the track faded into the October evening. Cole stood at the table with the document in front of him and was quiet for a long moment. "Pedersen," he said. "He's a good man," Mabel said. "He was scared. Scared people sign things." "I know." He wasn't angry at Pedersen, just tired. "Can it be undone?" "If he signed under incomplete disclosure, probably. Hardcastle would know." She paused. "But that's tomorrow's problem." Cole looked at her. She was still in her riding coat, still had the dust of 2 days on the trail on her, and she was standing at his kitchen table having just navigated a legal ambush after a 4-day cattle drive through canyon country on a route she'd carried in her head, and her voice was steady and her hands were steady, and she had the look of someone who is tired in every layer of themselves but is not finished yet. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and he took her face in both his calloused, scarred hands, and he kissed her, directly and without preamble, the way he did most things. Without ceremony, but with complete intention. She was still for 1 beat. Then she wasn't. When they separated, she looked at him with an expression that had none of her usual armor in it. Not afraid, not surprised exactly, just open in the undefended way that faces are when something happens that the careful part of you has been preventing for months. "I should have done that sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He laughed. A real one, short and unguarded. The laugh of a man ambushed by something he hadn't expected from himself. She'd never heard it before, and it was better than she'd imagined, which was saying something because she'd imagined it more than she would have admitted. Huck Pedersen came to the ranch the next morning before Cole had sent for him, which meant his conscience had gotten there first. He sat at the table with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has spent the night with something he's not proud of. "I shouldn't have signed," he said. "Tom came the day you left, and the storm had just come through, and I was scared, and he had the agent there, and I didn't—" He stopped. "I should have waited." "Yes," Cole said, without elaboration, because there was no point in elaborating. "Can it be fixed?" "Mabel thinks so, if you'll swear you weren't fully informed of the drought clause implications." "I'll swear to anything," Pedersen said. "It's true. It took 2 weeks and 2 letters to Hardcastle and 1 formal deposition from Pedersen about the circumstances of the signing, but the document was voided. The land agent, upon review, declined to defend his participation in the process, which told its own story about what he'd understood and chosen not to say. Tom Harlow did not come back to Cole's ranch after that evening. He was present in town, present at the feed store and at the church, and at the places where a man with property in Red Hollow is present. But something had shifted in the specific way that things shift in small towns when a maneuver fails publicly. Not dramatically, not with a scene, but in the gradual reconfiguration of who stands where and who talks to whom, and which conversations stop when which people enter a room. Davis Harlow came to Cole in the 3rd week of November and apologized for his brother, which was not something Davis Harlow was accustomed to doing and which showed on his face the effort it cost him. Cole accepted it simply, without making him repeat it or elaborate, which was a mercy, and both of them knew it. The winter settled over Red Hollow with the particular severity that follows a drought year, as if the land was exhausted and needed the cold to finish recovering. The canyon water held, the springs ran clear through November and December, and Cole's east range, with access to the water, came through the winter in better condition than it had any right to expect. Elias Rowan got sick in December, not catastrophically, a chest complaint that laid him up for 3 weeks and required care that Mabel provided. And that meant Cole came to the Rowan house more often, which was noted by the town with the particular attention that towns pay to things that have been happening for a while but are now happening in a new context. He fixed the fence post her father had been meaning to fix since October. He brought food, which he presented as excess from his own stores, which was not convincing, but which preserved her father's dignity, which was the point. Elias, flat on his back in a sick room with reduced options for self-deception, told Cole Mercer on a Tuesday afternoon that he was a decent man and that he was sorry for not being more of one himself. Cole said that Elias had raised a daughter who could carry the canyon route in her head and navigate a land dispute before she'd had a meal, and that whatever he'd done wrong, he'd done something right. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She gets it from her mother," which was the first time in Mabel's memory that he'd said her mother's name. Not out loud, but in the space where a name would be, with the rawness of something that had been sealed for a long time. Mabel, who was in the doorway, and who both of them had not quite registered, went back to the kitchen and did not say anything, but sat at the table for a few minutes with her hands flat on the surface before she got up and went back to work. In January, Cole asked her to marry him. He did it at the laundry, which was both impractical and somehow exactly right, on a cold morning when the light through the one good window was the pale gray of winter sun, and she was up to her elbows in steaming water and he was there with no washing and no injured hand and no geological question. She looked at him. "This is not a good time," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. She looked at the window for a moment, at the gray light, at the steam coming off the water. Then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said. He nodded once with the contained expression of a man absorbing something very large, very quietly. "Yes," she said again, more quietly, just to hear herself say it. They were married in February, at the courthouse rather than a church, in front of Harcastle and Pedersen and Davis Harlow and Seth Marsh and her father, who was recovered enough to stand for the duration and who cried, which surprised him more than anyone. Red Hollow talked about it with the energy that a town reserves for events that require significant reinterpretation of its own prior positions. Darlene Fitch attended the small reception at the Mercer Ranch. Nobody quite knew why, possibly she herself didn't quite know why, and said very little but stayed for an hour, which was its own kind of statement about where the wind was blowing now. The spring brought Fenn's letter, as promised, offering route planning fees for the next northern drive. Mabel wrote back with terms that were specific and fair and that Fenn accepted without counteroffer, which told her she'd pitched them correctly. Cole found her composition book open on the kitchen table with new maps started. The Cimarron Pass in detail now, and a water stop analysis for the extended route. And notes in her small, precise handwriting about terrain variations she'd identified from 2 additional survey documents that had come through the county office and that nobody else had claimed. He stood at the table and looked at the maps for a moment. "You started on the spring drive already," he said. "The planning takes time," she said from the other side of the kitchen, where she was doing something with dried beans that required her full attention. "And the surveys don't read themselves." "No," he said, "they don't." He got his coffee and sat at the table beside the maps and looked at them properly. The hand-drawn lines, the elevations noted in her careful numbers, the water stop markers with their estimated flow rates, and felt, not for the first time, the specific quality of sitting next to someone who has been thinking about something longer and harder than you have, and who will tell you what they found if you ask the right way. Outside, the canyon water was running steady into the East Range. The grass was coming in. The herd was 29 cattle now, 6 more than when the story started, which is not a grand number, but is the kind of number that tells you a year has been survived and something has been built that wasn't there before. Tom Harlow, that spring, sold 50 acres on his north boundary and was quiet about why. The land went to Causey, who had signed the Canyon Drive agreement and who now had access to the water route, which improved his north range considerably. Tom was still in Red Hollow. He would probably always be in Red Hollow. He had his position and his opinions and his particular resentments, and he was not the kind of man who revised those things fundamentally. But the space he occupied in the town's calculations had shifted, not dramatically, not with any public reckoning, just the slow, grinding recalibration that happens when the thing someone bet against succeeds and doesn't stop succeeding. Jessup and Ford, the 2 ranch hands who'd spent the previous summer making noise about Cole's choices, found other things to be interested in as the year progressed. The name Rowan's man fell out of circulation, not because anyone formally retired it, those things don't get formally retired in small towns, but because it had stopped doing what it was meant to do, which was diminish, and a tool that doesn't work eventually stops getting picked up. Mabel noticed all of this the way she noticed most things, precisely, without ceremony, filing it in the part of her mind that kept track of the world's actual behavior versus what it claimed about itself. The change in Red Hollow was not a conversion. The town did not wake up one morning having understood something it hadn't understood the night before. What happened was smaller and more durable than that. What happened was that the story changed, incrementally, season by season, fact by fact, until the old version of it became harder to tell with a straight face. Until the woman who had been the footnote of someone else's narrative became, in her own stubborn, patient, precise way, a fact about the town that the town had to incorporate whether it wanted to or not. There is something in the particular blindness that small communities, and perhaps not only small ones, develop toward the people they've decided don't count. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just the terrible laziness of assuming that the person who doesn't announce themselves doesn't have anything worth hearing. That quiet means empty. That overlooked means unworthy of looking at. Mabel Rowan had known, for most of her adult life, that she was being looked past, and she had done the thing that people who are looked past sometimes do. If they're stubborn enough and curious enough and angry enough in the specific quiet way that doesn't burn itself out, she had kept accumulating. Knowledge, plans, maps, the location of water that everyone else had given up on, routes through terrain that everyone else called impassable. She had kept all of it in that composition book and in her head, where it was safe from the opinions of a town that had not asked for it. What Cole Mercer had done, what his genuine, specific, entirely impractical act of paying attention had done, was not save her. She had not needed saving. What it had done was create the first circumstance in which her accumulation had somewhere to go. Someone who asked. Someone who came back with better questions because he'd gone and done the reading she'd recommended. Someone who stood in a mercantile and a laundry and a courthouse and a yard full of men who doubted her and said, "Without fanfare, I trust her reading." That is not a small thing. In a life shaped by being made to feel small, it is, in fact, the largest kind of thing there is. By the second winter of their marriage, the ranch had 41 cattle and a second barn and a kitchen garden that Mabel had expanded to the east side of the house, where the soil was better and which produced enough by summer to sell at the market. Her father had moved into the small room off the back of the ranch house. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the gradual drift of a man who has fewer reasons to stay in a house alone. He was drinking less. Not nothing, but less, which was not a resolution but was a direction. And direction was what you could ask for. Elias sat on the ranch porch on an April morning, watching his daughter walk back from the canyon with her composition book under her arm and her boots muddy from the spring ground, and he had the expression of a man looking at something he's never seen clearly before and is trying to make up for lost time. Cole came out with coffee and sat beside him. "She went to check the spring channels," Elias said. "She does that," Cole said. "Does she find things? When she goes?" "Always," Cole said. Elias turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She's been doing that her whole life," he said. "Finding things. He stopped. The sentence had something in it he couldn't finish. "I never asked." Cole looked out at Mabel, moving across the spring grass with her sure, unhurried stride, the composition book already open. "She doesn't need you to have asked back then," he said. "She needs you to ask now." Elias nodded slowly. When Mabel came up the porch steps, her father said, "What did you find?" She stopped, looked at him with those wide, direct eyes. "The North Channel flow is up 14% from last year," she said, "and there's a secondary seam running east that I hadn't mapped. It might reach the Causey property line." "Is that good?" Elias asked. "It could be very good," she said, "for Causey, and for the route timing in summer." Elias nodded. "Tell me how," he said. She sat down on the porch step, below their chairs, her composition book open on her knee, and she told him. All of it. The seam angle, the soil composition, the way it connected to the broader channel system, what it meant for summer water pressure. She told him with the same detail and precision she brought to everything, and Elias listened with the imperfect, late, genuine attention of a man trying to learn something he should have learned years ago. Cole drank his coffee and said nothing, and looked out at the canyon country, at the spring grass coming in green on ground that had been gray with drought less than a year before, at the water running clear in the East Channel that had been dry for 8 years before a woman put her ear to a stone and listened. Red Hollow was still Red Hollow. It would always be the town it was, with its gossip and its hierarchies and its refusal to revise itself more than the minimum required by evidence. There would always be a Darlene Fitch calibrating worth against appearance, always a Tom Harlow moving angles, always a Jessup or Ford looking for something to diminish because diminishment is easier than the work of genuine accounting. But there was also this, A ranch on the canyon lip with water running clean through the East Range. A woman with a composition book full of things nobody had asked for until someone asked. A man who had looked at a town full of easier choices and understood, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who reads land for a living, that the most valuable things are not always the most visible. And sometimes, not always. Not without cost. Not without the wire cuts, and the stitched-up arguments, and the maps that don't survive the storm. Sometimes the water is exactly where the quiet person said it was. 20 feet down, behind the shale. Real all along.